Jae Puckett, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University and lead Trans-ilience, the Transgender Stress and Resilience research team there. And today I'll be talking about a study where we asked transgender and gender diverse folks how they would like their gender to be asked about in research studies. So really coming from a community engaged perspective to learn more about how trans people actually want researchers to ask about their identities. And so just to acknowledge my co-authors here too, Nina Brown, Tara Dunn, Brian Mustansky, and Michael Newcomb. Next slide. All right. So we know from the literature that there are some major issues that exist in research when measuring gender, and these are just a few of the common issues that come up in research studies. So for one, we see that researchers oftentimes conflate sex and gender, so asking about these as if they are the same thing, or combining them into like a single question. We also see that researchers will sometimes have options in their list of gender identities that they will interpret as being about cisgender people, but not explicitly label them as cisgender in the options. So rather than just having, man or woman in the gender identity options, we should have things that actually indicate how we're going to interpret those responses. So if they're going to be interpreted as cisgender people, to be able to specify that in the options themselves. We also see that there are limited representations of diverse gender identities, so a range of identities that exist for trans folks. And oftentimes researchers will leave out labels like non-binary, agender, gender fluid, and other identities. We also see problems with wording. So for example, using terms like sex, biological sex, and things like that instead of language like sex assigned at birth, which is more affirming. And then finally, we see some really problematic things going on where researchers will sometimes also interpret people's physical appearance or their voice to be a proxy of their gender. So, misgendering people by doing that as well. So, there's been some research about ideal ways to ask about gender in research studies. And so in general, there's kind of a consensus that a two-step method is best for asking about gender and is kind of preferred. So in that would mean asking about, typically it means asking about sex assigned at birth and gender identity. That way a person can indicate their gender identity, but also researchers can identify which participants are transgender in looking at comparisons between gender identity and sex assigned at birth. We also see that in this type of research evaluating questions about gender, that most often researchers are coming in with preformed questions about gender and then having cisgender people and trans folks to evaluate those questions and to examine comprehension of these questions. So one thing I want to note about that is that when this approach is taken, it hinges on the comprehension of cisgender people, which can unintentionally center the preferences and knowledge of cis people in these types of questions and limit the representation of trans people. So in this study, we sought to understand more about how trans people specifically desire their gender to be asked about in research studies. Next slide. Okay, so this was an online study, and we took a lot of steps to ensure the quality of the data. I can answer questions about that later if people want, but basically we had a branched enrollment where our primary study was a daily diary study, and so for inclusion for that, folks had to be between the ages of 16 and 40, identify as trans men, trans women, or genderqueer, non-binary, and had sex in the past 30 days and either binge drank or used substances in the past 30 days. So there's a lot of people who didn't meet criteria for that, so if they didn't, they were offered a chance to participate in a one-time survey as long as they were 16 and up and identified in any way as trans. These are the folks who are in this particular study here were the ones who were in that one-time survey. So in total, there were 695 participants, and their ages ranged from 16 to 73 with an average age of 25. You can see here that our sample was primarily white, so 75.7% white, limited racial and ethnic diversity across the other groups, and the sample primarily identified as queer and pansexual in terms of sexual orientation. And we had representation across a range of gender identities from trans men, trans women, genderqueer, non-binary, agender, a few other categories as well. Next slide. So this is the prompt that we gave participants. So we really wanted to get at how to best reflect folks' gender identities and questions, even in samples where most participants may be cisgender. So we wanted to frame the question in that way so people would have that in their mind as they're answering it. So participants were asked, in studies that are for anyone, regardless of gender identity, How would you like to see your gender represented in a question? Keep in mind that without some way of indicating that someone does not identify with their sex assigned at birth, the experiences of trans and gender nonconforming individuals may be overlooked. And so participants had the option to write in their response after that. And we did a thematic analysis of that data, and we found a few kind of common categories that emerged. Next slide. Excuse me. Okay, so one of the primary findings from the coding was that basically there are a lot of terms that participants would like to see represented in research studies, and that there are some nuanced ways of asking about these identities. So you can see on the slide here, there's a table with a whole list of different gender identity options. And so you can see that there's some identities that maybe are infrequently included in research studies, like agender, gender fluid, as well as a few others that are kind of acknowledging the nuance that might exist for people. So for example, some participants wrote that they wanted to be referred to as a man of transgender experience instead of a transgender man. So again, kind of highlighting the ways that this might vary across people. Next slide. The second category of suggestions centered around using a two-step method for asking about gender, and there were two possible ways that this came up for participants. So the first is what we talked about at the start of the study, or start of the presentation today, where you can ask about a person's sex assigned at birth and about their gender identity. So here participants would have the option for a list of inclusive terms about their current gender identity while also indicating their sex assigned at birth. And again, this method will allow researchers to differentiate between these variables and to identify trans participants without these participants necessarily explicitly identifying as trans, because some trans people don't like to include the prefix of trans for their gender identity and choose instead to just identify as a man or a woman without that prefix. So this participant's quote, I think, really exemplifies this. So make two separate questions, one about gender identity and a separate question about what gender a person was assigned at birth. If you have the question, what is your gender, and two of the options are cis man and trans man, you're implying that these two groups are different genders, which is transphobic, as they are both men. Basically, please don't ask what is your gender when you mean what is your sex and gender. So when we ask in this way, we allow participants to check the identities that feel most authentic for themselves while also being affirming. Next slide. So the second option of a two-step method is to provide an inclusive list of gender identities for participants to choose from, but then to have a follow-up question that asks whether a person identifies as trans or not. So in this way, this allows a person, again, to indicate the gender that they identify with, and to do so while not being perpetually connected to the sex they were assigned at birth, which can be problematic for some people. So if you read the quote here, I think this really gets at it. So if it should ask if we are trans rather than our birth assignment, because having to identify in any way with our sex assigned at birth can be very painful. So again here, just really allowing that flexibility for what fits for that person. So this type of question, like I said, still helps to identify trans participants and can be an affirming alternative to emphasizing a person's sex assigned at birth. Next slide. So the third category of responses was kind of a catch-all for additional consideration. So I just want to kind of briefly go through these. Participants emphasize the importance of being able to check multiple responses. So some people may, for instance, identify both as genderqueer and as transgender, or as a trans woman and non-binary, or other combinations, right? So the terms aren't mutually exclusive, and people may have a range of identities that they identify with. And if we allow participants to indicate multiple responses, this is likely a better reflection of their lived experience rather than asking people a forced choice option. Even though from the researcher side, it may feel like that's more challenging to approach from our data perspective. So another suggestion was to provide a fill-in-the-blank option. And so I know this also can present challenges too on the researcher end with the kind of then needing to code these responses, but I'll circle back to that later on today. So for example, this participant wrote in a question about gender, I believe the best way to ask would be just to provide a fill in the bar so everyone can write individually their own identity without feeling erased. Next slide. Okay. So a few other suggestions here. Participants said that it might be necessary to provide definitions. So, these definitions could be useful for both cisgender people and for some trans folks if there's identities that people may be unfamiliar with. So those definitions could be provided in the question itself or in kind of like the programming behind the survey. So, having the option to kind of hover over a response option and a definition pop up or something like that. Participants also emphasize the importance of differentiating terminology referring to sex assigned at birth and to gender. So here using language like male assigned at birth for sex assigned at birth category rather than putting male under a gender category. Participants also emphasize that it's important to indicate when terms are going to be interpreted as referring to cis people, so not leaving that kind of unsaid in the response options. And finally, they also talked about considering the order of the response options. So thinking about how our response options, the ways in which they're listed, can oftentimes replicate social hierarchies. So instead of having the options for cis people listed first, to really switch that up and have trans folks listed first in the response options. Next slide. So a couple of other suggestions here. Participants also spoke about providing options not to disclose a trans identity. So this participant wrote, I prefer to just see man for me. I hate the implication that transgender is some third gender, which others me and bars me from being seen fully as male. So here, this participant, is emphasizing the importance of having those response options that don't always have the prefix of trans. Another group of participants wrote about the importance of having the option not to answer the question. So sometimes people might have concerns about safety or about their identity being known to others, and so they might not wish to disclose this information in a given study for some of those reasons. And then another consideration here is that the context might also dictate how questions are worded and how participants respond to them. So one participant wrote, in studies where my being trans is significant or relevant, like this one, I would prefer to be listed as something like trans woman like above. But if that weren't relevant to the study, I would probably rather be listed as woman or female or something like that. So kind of taking into account the reasons why gender might be asked about in the first place, or the type of study that's being done, that might also influence the ways in which participants respond. Next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to pull together some recommendations based on this study and past research. Next slide. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is to consider the instructions for the item or any disclaimers that might be relevant to the study or how the question is asked. So first, I think it's helpful if researchers state why they're asking about gender in that specific study. I think as researchers, sometimes we don't have enough transparency in what we're doing or why we're doing it. And if we can provide some of that, it can help participants to understand some of the choices that we make. So this can help people to think through how they want to respond, and I would say can actually give greater agency to participants if we increase our transparency about why we do what we do as researchers. If we provide definitions, that can help people with just kind of interpretation of the questions and response options. So if there are identities that may be infrequently included or concern about cis people's understanding and comprehension of the question, if we provide some definitions, that can help to address that. And then, again, providing any disclaimers about choices in wording. If the survey is just for trans individuals and there's a response option of man, for example, then researchers can explain that the study is just for trans people, and therefore they haven't forgotten to include the word cisgender. It's just that there's not an option for cisgender people to participate. So I think that kind of disclaimer can help people to feel affirmed in the study and to not misinterpret something as being a microaggression within the context of the study. And then finally, again, indicating just whether it's a check-all format or a forced choice option. Next slide. So when it comes to asking about a participant's gender identity specifically, there are a few options I wanted to describe. So this is one possible prompt to ask, which of the following labels best describes your gender identity? And then researchers have a few possible response options. So you could have an exhaustive list of identities that includes cisgender and transgender specific identities. And you could go back to that table that I presented earlier to take a look at some possibilities for that. And I would say, it's best to always have an option for people to write in an identity if it's not listed. And I would say if you're doing that, to not use the language of other, just because that can be marginalizing to people. So to replace that with the language of not listed, please write in here. That way people can recognize that, you know, you have a limited set of options and to be able to specify what applies for them. Researchers also might want to include a brief list sometimes, and this could, you know, be for a number of reasons. Maybe there's space constraints or something like that, or concerns that are about providing a more exhaustive list of options. And if you do that, I would just say if you're doing that, to make sure to include options that specify when folks are cisgender or transgender. That way you're not being too restrictive in that in your options there either. And then finally, if you have a study that's only including trans folks, again, providing options for woman and man that does not include the prefix for people. And then I just wanted to note here that if researchers provide an extensive list of options, sometimes you're in a situation then where you might be faced with kind of recategorizing people into fewer options in order to do some of your analyses. So I just wanted to put out there that it's possible that you ask about gender in a couple of ways. So maybe you have an exhaustive list of options that you use to describe your sample, but then you can ask participants also, given that there's this range of options for people how people identify, if there were a smaller list of options, how would you identify? So you could ask something like, recognizing that these are limited options, which of the following best describes your gender identity? And then you could include options like trans man, trans woman, non-binary, and I do not feel that my gender fits into any of these categories. Or you could include other options like trans-masculine, trans-feminine, non-binary, genderqueer. You know, so you can kind of base that on your needs for your research study. But I like this because it takes away the issue with researchers recategorizing people, which can be really problematic in terms of like invalidating people's identities or using terms that might not actually describe the people who are within the category. So just making sure to prioritize how participants describe themselves. Next slide. So another option is to go with that open-ended response format, where participants are allowed to type in their responses for how they identify their gender. If you do that, you can approach this in a few different ways, where you can code the data to be able to summarize, again, at kind of summary level, how many people identified in certain ways. But then you can also ask some follow-up prompts to identify subgroups depending on what you're interested in and what's relevant to your research study. So if you are wanting to identify which participants in your sample were transgender, you can ask, you know, above you provided your gender identity. To assist us in properly classifying participants, please choose a gender identity label that most closely fits for you. And you could ask participants if they identify as transgender or not, or if they prefer not to answer. And you also can ask a few variations of this follow-up prompt as well. Next slide. So it's also important to think about the ways in which we ask about sex assigned at birth and whether a person is trans or not. So here are a few options based on the findings from the study. So you could ask, what sex were you assigned at birth, with response options of male assigned at birth, female assigned at birth, or intersex. You also could ask whether a person is cisgender, transgender, prefer not to say. Or you could ask participants, do you identify as transgender, with the response options yes, no, unsure, prefer not to say. And researchers can also consider asking questions around whether participants identify as intersex. Next slide. All right, so ultimately the format and design of the question, I think, really depends on the audience, the participants in your study, and the area of focus for your study. But even so, I would argue that we should really be prioritizing trans folks' ability to be represented in the research rather than the comprehension of cisgender people for these questions and terms. So if we do make decisions based on cis people's knowledge levels, I think we'll always inherently be limiting how affirming we can be in our questions, right? So rather than doing that, we should be aiming for higher levels of inclusion. So overall, although participants provided some really helpful suggestions that I think will be helpful for empowering participants in studies moving forward, we do still need more research about, you know, how these questions are interpreted by participants who are also trans, and evaluating how people respond to them moving forward. So there could be new kind of modifications that are needed. There's an evolving nature in which gender identities can be described in the language that's used. So this is something that would need to be an ongoing exploration rather than evaluating it one time. All right, next slide. So here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you do have any questions. You can also access the manuscript that's based on these findings here in LGBT health. And then I also wanted to mention that today is Transgender Day of Remembrance. And so I'm actually going to have to leave here in a few minutes for an event that our research team is helping out with. But I hope you also take some time today to learn about Trans Day of Remembrance and take some time to honor the trans people that we've lost this year and take a minute for that. But yes, if you do have any questions, you can just reach out to me directly via email and I'll get back to you that way.